He thought it was just another routine stop on a quiet American road. But in less than 5 minutes, everything he believed about power was about to collapse. The red and blue lights flickered across the asphalt, painting the empty stretch of highway in restless color as Officer Ryan Cole stepped out of his cruiser with the slow confidence of a man who had never been questioned, never been challenged, never been wrong in his own eyes. The humid night air clung to his uniform as he adjusted his belt and glanced toward the sleek black sedan idling ahead of him, its engine humming softly like it had nothing to fear. Inside sat Naomi Carter, hands steady on the wheel, her posture calm, her breathing even, as if this moment had already played out in her mind long before it ever happened. Ryan approached the driver's side window, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, reflecting briefly off her eyes, sharp, observant, unshaken. "License and registration," he said, his voice flat but edged with something colder, something heavier than authority. Naomi didn't move immediately, not out of defiance, but out of control, the kind of control that doesn't need to prove itself. Slowly, she reached into her bag, her movements precise, deliberate, as if every second carried weight. Ryan watched her closely, his gaze narrowing, already building a story in his head, already deciding who she was before she said a single word. "You in a hurry tonight?" he added, tilting his head slightly. The question less about speed and more about judgment. Naomi handed him her documents without a word, her eyes meeting his just long enough to register something he couldn't quite place, something that didn't fit his expectations, and for a brief second, something in his chest tightened, but he ignored it. People like him always did. He stepped back toward his cruiser, glancing once more at the car, at the woman inside it, at the quiet confidence that didn't belong to the narrative he had already written. Inside the patrol car, the radio crackled faintly, background noise he barely noticed as he ran her information, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel, impatience creeping in. Outside, Naomi remained still, the faint glow of the dashboard illuminating her face. Calm, composed, untouched by the tension building around her. Imagine sitting there, alone on a dark road, knowing that no matter what you say, the outcome has already been decided for you, but also knowing something else, something deeper, that the truth doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Ryan glanced at the screen, waiting for results, his jaw tightening as seconds stretched longer than they should have. Something was off. The system lagged, then refreshed, then paused again. He frowned, tapping the screen harder this time, irritation rising. Outside, the night remained silent, almost too silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Naomi's phone buzzed once beside her, a single notification lighting up the dark interior. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to, because she already knew what was coming. And somewhere between the hum of the engine and the flicker of those patrol lights, the balance of power had already begun to shift. Ryan just didn't realize it, yet the screen in Ryan Cole's cruiser flickered once more before stabilizing. But what appeared was not the quick confirmation he expected, not the simple record of a driver to categorize and dismiss. Instead, there was a delay, a hesitation in the system that made him shift in his seat, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel as impatience began to creep into his chest. He exhaled sharply and glanced back toward the black sedan, its silhouette unmoving under the glow of his patrol lights. "What are you hiding?" he muttered under his breath, already convinced there had to be something, because in his world, uncertainty always meant suspicion. Outside, Naomi Carter remained exactly as she had been, hands resting lightly, eyes forward, her expression unchanged. But inside, her awareness was precise, every second measured, every sound accounted for. She could hear the faint static from his radio, even from a distance, the subtle shift in his posture when things did not go his way. She had seen men like him before, not just on roads like this, but in rooms far more powerful, men who mistook authority for truth, men who believed control was something you could hold on to indefinitely. The notification on her phone faded, the screen dimming again into darkness, but its message lingered in the air around her, unseen yet undeniable. Back in the cruiser, Ryan leaned closer to the monitor. The system refreshed again, this time loading a file that did not match the tone of a routine stop. There were flags, restricted access markers, identifiers he rarely encountered. His brow furrowed, confusion cutting through his confidence. "Come on," he said under his breath, tapping the screen again as if force would give him clarity. But clarity did not come the way he expected. Instead, the radio beside him crackled louder, sharper this time. A voice breaking through the static with urgency that did not belong to ordinary dispatch chatter. "Unit 7, confirm status," the voice said, firm, controlled. Ryan reached for the radio, pressing the button with a hint of annoyance. "Routine traffic stop," he replied, his tone steady but slightly defensive, as if he needed to reassert control. There was a pause on the other end, not long, but long enough to feel different, long enough to plant doubt. Outside, the air seemed to thicken, the distant hum of tires on asphalt fading into the background. Naomi finally shifted slightly in her seat, not out of discomfort, but out of decision, her gaze lifting toward the rearview mirror, catching the reflection of flashing lights behind her, calm, unwavering, as if she already understood how this would unfold. Inside the cruiser, the voice returned, lower now, more deliberate. "Unit 7, stand by and do not escalate." The words landed heavier than Ryan expected, his grip tightening around the radio, confusion now mixing with irritation. "Do not escalate," he repeated quietly to himself, the phrase echoing in his mind, challenging the narrative he had built from the moment he stepped out of his car. He glanced once more at the screen, at the incomplete information, at the warnings he did not fully understand, and for the first time that night, a question formed that he could not immediately answer, not about her, but about himself, about whether he had already crossed a line he could not see. And out on that quiet stretch of road, under those flashing lights, the silence between them grew heavier, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous, the slow, inevitable approach of truth. Ryan Cole stepped out of his cruiser again, the radio still echoing faintly in his mind. "Do not escalate." The words did not sit right with him. They did not match the rhythm of his authority, and as his boots met the pavement, something in his posture shifted, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it. A subtle crack in the certainty he had carried for years. He approached the sedan once more, slower this time, his flashlight no longer sweeping aggressively, but instead held steady at his side. Naomi Carter watched him through the side mirror, her expression unchanged, calm in a way that did not challenge him but did not yield either, and that calmness unsettled him more than resistance ever could. "Ma'am," he said, his tone now measured, searching for footing he could not quite find. "I am going to need you to step out of the vehicle." The request hung in the air, heavier than before, not just an order, but a test. Naomi did not respond immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she understood timing. She had spent years in rooms where seconds decided outcomes, where silence spoke louder than commands. Slowly, she reached for the door handle, the soft click breaking the stillness as she stepped out onto the asphalt, the faint night breeze brushing against her, carrying with it the distant scent of warm pavement and dry grass. She stood straight, composed, her eyes meeting his without hesitation, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Imagine standing there, under flashing lights, being measured not by your actions but by assumptions already written, yet knowing that the truth you carry cannot be erased by someone else's perception. Ryan cleared his throat, shifting slightly as he tried to regain control of the situation. "Is there a reason you seemed hesitant back there?" he asked, the question framed as procedure but edged with something personal. Naomi's gaze did not waver. "No, officer," she replied, her voice even, controlled, carrying no trace of fear, only clarity, and that clarity pressed against him in a way he did not expect. He circled slightly, glancing at the vehicle, then back at her, as if searching for something that would confirm the story he had already built, but nothing fit, nothing aligned, and the more he looked, the less certain he became. Behind him, the radio crackled again, louder this time, sharper, cutting through the quiet tension like a warning that refused to be ignored. "Unit 7, confirm compliance," the voice said, firmer now. Ryan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before responding. "Subject is outside the vehicle," he said, his words slower, more deliberate, as if he were choosing them carefully now. There was another pause, longer than before, stretching across the distance between authority and understanding. Naomi stood still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture unthreatening yet unmovable. She glanced briefly at the horizon, where faint headlights appeared far down the road, approaching steadily, not hurried, not uncertain, just inevitable. And in that moment, something shifted again, not in the air, not in the lights, but in Ryan himself, because for the first time that night, he was no longer sure who was in control, and the realization did not come loudly. It did not announce itself. It settled quietly, like a truth he had spent years avoiding. As the distant headlights grew brighter, reflecting off the polished surface of Naomi's car, off the badge on his chest, off the assumptions that were beginning to unravel, and somewhere between the sound of his own breathing and the hum of approaching engines, the balance he thought he understood slipped just a little further out of his grasp. The approaching headlights grew brighter, steady and deliberate. Not like passing traffic, but like something with purpose, something that already knew exactly where it was going. Ryan Cole turned his head slightly, squinting into the distance as the beams cut through the dark highway. His instincts told him this was no coincidence. Not at this hour, not on this road. Behind him, Naomi Carter remained still, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded in a calm that did not react, did not flinch, did not seek approval. And that calm now seemed to stretch beyond her, as if it extended into whatever was coming down that road. The radio at Ryan's shoulder crackled again, sharper this time. No longer casual, no longer routine. Unit 7, remain where you are. The voice said, each word precise, controlled, leaving no room for interpretation. Ryan's grip tightened slightly on the radio, his jaw setting as a flicker of resistance passed through him, because orders like that were not meant for him, not in situations like this, not when he was the one standing in control, and yet something in the tone of that voice made it clear this was different. The headlights slowed, then split into two distinct vehicles, both dark, both unmarked, both moving with the kind of coordination that did not require explanation. They pulled onto the shoulder with quiet precision, engines low, doors still closed, and for a moment, the entire scene seemed to pause, as if time itself had decided to wait. Imagine standing there, watching something unfold that you do not understand yet knowing, deep down, that whatever is about to happen is going to change everything you thought you knew. Ryan straightened slightly, adjusting his stance, trying to reclaim the authority that had begun slipping through his fingers. Ma'am, do you know who those vehicles belong to? He asked, his voice carrying a trace of tension he could no longer fully hide. Naomi's eyes followed the vehicles for only a second before returning to him, her expression steady, unreadable. Yes, she said simply, no hesitation, no elaboration, just certainty. And that single word landed heavier than anything else she could have said, because it confirmed what he was starting to fear, that this moment had never really been his to control. The doors of the vehicles opened. Almost in unison, figures stepping out, their movements measured, their presence unmistakable, not loud, not aggressive, but absolute. The kind of authority that does not need to announce itself because it is already understood. Ryan felt it before he could process it. That shift, that invisible line crossing from assumption into reality. His heartbeat picked up, not from fear, but from something closer to realization. The kind that arrives too late to be ignored. The radio went silent now, as if it had said everything it needed to say. Naomi stood without moving, her silhouette framed by the patrol lights and the incoming beams. And in that moment, she no longer looked like someone caught in a situation. She looked like someone waiting for it to reach its inevitable conclusion. Ryan took a small step back, almost unconsciously, his mind racing to catch up with what was unfolding in front of him. And somewhere between the sound of doors closing and footsteps approaching, the truth began to take shape, not in words, not yet, but in the undeniable weight of presence, in the realization that this was never just a traffic stop, and that the power he thought he held had already been replaced by something far beyond his understanding. The sound of footsteps against asphalt was soft, but unmistakable, measured in a way that carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. Ryan Cole felt it before he fully understood it. That shift in the air, that quiet transfer of control that did not ask for permission, The figures from the vehicles approached with calm precision, their presence composed, their focus direct, and for the first time that night, Ryan did not speak immediately. He did not issue a command. He simply watched, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed. One of the men stepped forward, his posture straight, his expression neutral but firm. The kind of expression that did not invite argument. "Officer Cole," he said, not as a question, but as a confirmation. Ryan nodded once, his voice slower now. "Yes." And in that single exchange, something subtle but undeniable shifted, because the authority in that man's voice did not come from a badge. It came from something larger, something structured, something that existed beyond the reach of a single patrol car on a quiet road. The man's gaze moved briefly past Ryan, landing on Naomi Carter. And in that moment, there was recognition, not surprise, not confusion, but acknowledgement, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who stands in front of you. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, a single word that carried weight far beyond its simplicity. Naomi inclined her head slightly, her composure unchanged, as if this moment had always been inevitable, as if the path leading here had already been mapped long before any siren had been turned on. Ryan's chest tightened, not from fear, but from realization, because that word, that tone, that shift in dynamic, it rewrote everything he thought he understood. He glanced between them, searching for clarity, but clarity did not come in explanations. It came in silence, in the way no one rushed, no one raised their voice, no one needed to assert control, because control was already present. The man turned back to Ryan, his expression steady. "We will take it from here," he said, and the sentence landed with finality, not confrontational, not aggressive, just absolute. Ryan opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, as if to reclaim something, but the words did not come the way they usually did, because for the first time, he was not sure what authority he still had to stand on. Imagine standing there, realizing that everything you built your confidence on was never as solid as you believed, that the power you carried was only real until it met something greater. Naomi remained still, her presence calm, grounded, untouched by the tension that had defined the last several minutes. She did not need to explain herself. She did not need to reveal anything, because the truth was already unfolding around her, piece by piece, in ways Ryan could not control, could not interrupt, could not deny. The man reached into his jacket and briefly showed identification, not in a dramatic gesture, not in a way meant to intimidate, but in a way that made one thing clear. This situation had moved beyond a routine encounter, beyond assumptions, beyond anything Ryan had prepared for. The night air felt heavier now, not with conflict, but with clarity, and as Ryan stood there, caught between what he thought he knew and what was now undeniable, the realization settled deeper, slower, more permanent, that this was never just about a car, or a stop, or a suspicion. It was about something far more significant, something he had failed to recognize from the very beginning. And as the quiet authority of that moment surrounded him, one truth became impossible to ignore. The power he believed he held had never truly belonged to him at all. Ryan Cole did not move right away, his body still caught between instinct and uncertainty, the weight of the moment pressing against him in a way he had never experienced before. The man standing in front of him did not raise his voice, did not repeat himself, and yet the instruction, "We will take it from here," echoed louder than any command Ryan had ever given. For a brief second, Ryan glanced at his own badge, the metal reflecting the flashing lights in fractured patterns, and something about that reflection felt different now, smaller somehow, less absolute than it had been just minutes ago. "I was just conducting a standard stop," Ryan said finally, his tone attempting to recover its firmness, but the edge was gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to justification than authority. The man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, as if he had already heard enough long before Ryan spoke. "Understood," he replied calmly, but there was no agreement in his voice, only acknowledgement. Naomi Carter remained a few steps away, her presence steady, her gaze forward, not watching the exchange, not needing to, because this part was no longer about confrontation, it was about consequence. Imagine realizing that the moment you thought you were in control was actually the moment everything shifted beyond your reach. Ryan exhaled slowly, his mind trying to piece together what he had missed, what signs had been there that he chose not to see, the delayed system response, the radio instructions, the calm in Naomi's voice, the absence of fear, all of it forming a pattern he had ignored until it was too late. The man turned slightly, gesturing toward one of the vehicles, and another individual stepped forward, holding a tablet, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. Information moved across it with quiet precision, and though Ryan could not see the details, he understood enough to know that this situation had been documented, recorded, evaluated in real time, far beyond his awareness. Naomi took a single step forward then, not toward Ryan, but toward the group, her movement smooth, deliberate, and in that step, the distance between perception and reality closed completely. "Officer," she said, her voice calm, not accusatory, not emotional, just clear. Ryan looked at her, really looked at her this time, not as a subject, not as a suspicion, but as a person he had failed to understand. "There are moments that define how we use authority," she continued, her tone steady, measured, each word landing without force but with undeniable weight. "And there are moments that reveal why we were given it." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with everything that had just unfolded, everything that could not be undone. Ryan felt it settle into him, not as embarrassment, not as fear, but as awareness, the kind that stays long after the moment has passed. The man beside Naomi gave a small nod, signaling something unspoken but understood, and the situation moved forward without resistance. Without escalation, just resolution. Ryan stepped back slightly, his posture no longer rigid, no longer certain, as the roles he had assumed at the start of the night quietly dissolved. The flashing lights still painted the road in red and blue, but they no longer defined the scene, because the real shift had already happened, not in the lights, not in the voices, but in the understanding that had taken their place. And as Ryan stood there, watching control slip into the hands of those who never needed to prove it, one truth settled deeper than anything else. Authority is not about who speaks the loudest. It is about who understands its weight when no one is watching. The night no longer felt like it belonged to Ryan Cole. The road, the lights, even the silence had shifted into something he could not command. The figures who had arrived moved with quiet coordination, no wasted motion, no unnecessary words, as if every step had already been decided long before this moment. One of them spoke softly into a device, relaying information in a tone that carried certainty, not urgency, and that difference alone said everything. Ryan stood a few feet back now, no longer at the center, no longer directing the scene, and the realization settled deeper with every passing second. This was never his stage. Naomi Carter walked toward her vehicle, not hurried, not hesitant. Her steps measured with the same calm that had defined her from the very beginning. She paused briefly by the driver's side door, her hand resting lightly against the surface, the reflection of the flashing lights dancing across the polished paint. Then she turned, her gaze meeting Ryan's once more, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more difficult to face: understanding. Imagine being seen not for what you thought you were, but for what your actions revealed in a single moment. Ryan felt it, that weight, not imposed, not forced, but undeniable, as if the truth had simply stepped into the light and refused to leave. "Officer Cole," one of the men said, his voice steady, bringing Ryan's attention back to the present. "You will be contacted regarding this incident." The words were formal, procedural, but beneath them was something else, something final. Ryan nodded slowly, the motion almost automatic, his thoughts no longer racing, but settling into a quiet clarity he had not known before. The kind that does not come from being told, but from being shown. Naomi opened the car door, the soft sound breaking the stillness, but she did not get in immediately. Instead, she looked out at the road ahead, the long stretch of asphalt disappearing into the darkness, and for a brief moment, everything seemed still again, not tense, not uncertain, just still, like the calm after something irreversible has already taken place. She spoke then, not loudly, not directed at anyone in particular, but clear enough to be heard. "The uniform does not make the person," she said, her voice steady, carrying across the quiet road. "The person defines the uniform." The words lingered, not as a reprimand, not as a lesson delivered with force, but as a truth placed gently into the space between them. Ryan lowered his gaze for a moment, not out of submission, but reflection, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to defend. The vehicles behind them began to shift, doors closing, engines starting, the operation moving forward with the same quiet efficiency it had arrived with. Naomi finally stepped into her car, the door closing softly behind her, and as the engine started, the low hum filled the space that had once been occupied by tension. Ryan watched as the headlights turned, aligning with the road ahead, and then, without hesitation, the car moved forward, merging into the night as if it had never been stopped at all. The flashing lights of his cruiser continued to pulse, but they felt different now, no longer symbols of control, but reminders of a moment that had redefined everything. And as the last of the unmarked vehicles pulled away, leaving him alone on that quiet stretch of road, Ryan stood there, the weight of what had happened settling into something permanent, something that would not fade with time, because some moments do not end when the scene clears. Some moments stay, reshaping the way you see the world, the way you see yourself. And as the darkness reclaimed the road, one truth remained, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and unshakable. The real measure of authority is not how it is used when no one questions it, but how it stands when the truth finally does. The road returned to silence. But it was not the same silence as before. It carried weight now, memory, something that lingered in the air long after the headlights had disappeared into the distance. Ryan Cole stood beside his cruiser, the red and blue lights still flashing against the empty highway, but they no longer felt like symbols of control. They felt like echoes, reminders of a moment that had shifted everything without raising its voice. He slowly turned back toward his car, each step heavier than the last, not because of exhaustion, but because of realization, the kind that settles in quietly and refuses to leave. He reached the driver's door and paused, his reflection staring back at him in the window, distorted slightly by the pulsing lights. And for the first time in a long time, he did not recognize the certainty in that reflection. He saw something else instead, something unsettled, something questioning. Imagine looking at yourself and realizing that the version you trusted was built on assumptions you never challenged. He opened the door and sat inside, the familiar interior no longer grounding him the way it once did. The radio remained silent, no new instructions, no follow-up, just the faint hum of static, as if the system itself had moved on, leaving him alone with the aftermath. He placed his hands on the steering wheel, staring ahead at the stretch of road Naomi had disappeared into, and for a moment, he replayed everything, not the stop itself, but the details he had overlooked, the calm in her voice, the certainty in her eyes, the way she had never once reacted the way he expected, because she had never needed to. The truth had been on her side from the beginning. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing, replaced by something deeper, something more lasting. Accountability, not the kind enforced by others, but the kind that comes from within, the kind that forces you to confront what you have done without excuses, without deflection. Outside, the night stretched on, cars passing, occasionally in the distance, unaware of what had just unfolded on this quiet stretch of highway, unaware that something invisible but significant had shifted. Ryan reached for the radio, his hand hovering over it for a moment before he finally pressed the button. Unit 7, traffic stop complete, he said, his voice steady but different now, stripped of the edge it once carried. There was no need to explain further, no need to justify, because some things could not be undone with words, only understood over time. He released the button and leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a brief second, not to escape, but to acknowledge, to accept, to let the moment settle fully into who he was becoming. When he opened his eyes again, the road ahead looked the same, but it did not feel the same, because he was not the same. The lights on his cruiser continued to flash, but after a moment, he reached forward and turned them off. One switch, one decision, and just like that, the colors disappeared, leaving only the natural darkness of the night, quiet, honest, unfiltered. And as he sat there, no longer surrounded by the illusion of control, one thought remained, clear and undeniable. Authority is not proven in moments of dominance. It is revealed in moments of restraint. And sometimes, The most important lesson does not come from what you enforce, but from what you finally understand. Morning came quietly, without drama, without announcement, just a slow shift in light that replaced the darkness of the night before. And yet for Ryan Cole, the road he drove that day did not feel the same as it had every other morning of his career. The familiar streets, the routine traffic, the rhythm of patrol, all of it was unchanged, and still, something beneath it had shifted in a way he could not ignore. He sat in his cruiser at a red light, watching the steady flow of cars pass through the intersection, people moving on with their lives, unaware of the moment that had unfolded miles away the night before, unaware of the quiet lesson that had settled into him without force, without noise. Imagine carrying something no one else can see, not a burden placed on you, but a truth you can no longer unlearn. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his posture different now, less rigid, more aware, as if each movement carried intention rather than assumption. The radio buzzed softly with routine updates, minor incidents, standard calls, the kind of things that once filled his day without question. But now each word felt different, not heavier, but clearer, as if he was hearing them for what they were instead of what he expected them to be. A pedestrian crossing sign blinked steadily on the corner, and Ryan noticed how he slowed earlier than usual, giving space, giving time, not because he had to, but because he chose to. And that difference, small as it seemed, mattered more than anything else. Later that afternoon, he stepped out of his cruiser at a routine stop sign violation. A young driver sat behind the wheel, hands visible, eyes uncertain, and for a brief moment, the scene mirrored something familiar, something recent. But this time, Ryan paused, just for a second longer than before, long enough to let awareness guide him instead of instinct, long enough to see the person before the situation. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice calm, even, without edge, without assumption. The driver nodded, tension easing almost immediately. And in that simple exchange, something new took shape. Not power, not control, but respect, the kind that does not demand, the kind that is given. And as the interaction continued, measured, fair, grounded, Ryan felt it. Not as redemption, not as correction, but as alignment. A quiet step towards something better, something more honest. The sun moved lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement, and as Ryan returned to his cruiser, he paused once more, looking out at the road ahead, not as something to control, but as something to move through with awareness, because some lessons do not come from training. They come from moments that expose who you are when no one expects you to change, and those moments do not disappear. They stay, shaping every decision that follows. And somewhere beyond the reach of that quiet city street, Naomi Carter continued forward as she always had, carrying responsibility without needing recognition, her presence unchanged by what had happened, because for her, it was never about proving anything, it was about embodying it. And as the day moved on, one truth remained, steady and unshakable. He wore a badge to represent the law, but that night, he learned that the law is not defined by power. It is defined by the people who choose to uphold it with dignity.